Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art and culture, and this is the sort of episode where I'm doing something a little bit different, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. Should be pretty easy to notice if you're paying attention, but hey, when it comes to stuff like this, you'd be surprised how few people will actually catch on. But enough dropping clues, let's get on the pulse. So we got 7 projects on the docket. Before we go into them, if you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. Again, these multi-album episodes are tough to get things going. Let's see some traction. But now on to the matter at hand. From Patricia Taxxon, Aeroplane. I'm a little bit surprised my patrons wanted me to talk about Patricia Taxxon's newest ambient project. Not that I was against it, but given how many of her projects that I've covered at this point, you eventually start running out of things to say, especially within this subgenre. Now in this case, it's less pure ambient music so much as dabbling into progressive house, across arguably one of her most expansive and airy mixes to date, where even some of the blown out, roiling bro-step textures, the chirpy, glassy synth flutters that she's had for years now, and her more progressive, sharper percussion have a lot more space to breathe and ricochet off each other. A nice surprise for me was how these might be some of the most deceptively catchy melodic grooves that she's assembled since Rainbow Road, especially on the album's stronger back half. That was a nice surprise, all of which have a remarkably pleasant buoyancy that gives the album that could otherwise feel pretty long a surprising amount of momentum, especially down to the end. Now I do think there's a couple percussion pads that feel a little bit chalky, for lack of better words, or that patter and impact right at the very front of the mix and don't really have much depth. But honestly, those are some pretty minor quibbles, all things considered, for a project that feels so glittery, crisp, and still spacious enough in order to give the layered melodies some real sticking power. Probably the most I've liked a Patricia Taxxon project since the Ballet trilogy back in 2020. No, it does not reinvent the wheel with Taxxon's work, nor do I think it rises to her best in either house or ambient, but I'd argue it's actually pretty close to great all the same. So yeah, you want to get back on board? Check this out. Next up, from Carolyn Spence, True North. I was late to discussing Carolyn Spence back in 2019, basically picking up on her sound thanks to her excellent album Mint Condition that has only gotten better with time. It wasn't a particularly immediate album, but that actually worked to its advantage, providing you actually gave it the proper time. But I was not about to wait around when she released her follow-up this year, and well, it's a little bit trickier to talk about this one. Like with Mint Condition, it's very much a slow burn, and that means it can seem like it loses momentum kind of quickly. But if anything, it feels even more soft and lethargic, especially by its final third, where despite all the very textured dream country atmospherics, it can kind of get a little sleepy. Granted, it's just as melodic, if not more so, thanks to some of the twinkling keyboards that show up on cuts like Mary Oliver and Blue Sky Rain, or the more percussive snarl that came off of Icarus, but it's even less immediate this time around, slightly less striking hooks, and that places it a step back from Mint Condition, but also kind of makes sense when you dig into the themes. Like a lot of singer-songwriter acts, Carolyn Spence was diving into a lot of personal introspection and attempts at self-care in the wake of the past 2 years, and while this album does feel more settled, she's also more self-aware of how contextualizing her pain in her art isn't always healthy either. Mary Oliver is one of the best moments here, if only because of her frustration in commodifying her pain or implying a resolution when it just doesn't really happen like that in reality. What's more interesting is that even as she's done the work of repair, it's also kind of a shaky foundation, and she's more aware than anyone else that the walls that she put up to protect herself aren't always the most healthy thing either, with songs like I Know You Know Me and Scale These Walls pleading for someone to actually put in the work in order to get to know her and actually get to love love her. And it's also clear that her own rougher impulses aren't gone either, and she's still grappling with the implications of all that, from the cautions of Clean Getaway to the recklessness of Icarus, where she shoves aside the cautionary tale. But for as introspective as the album is, Carolyn Spence is also aware of how this cascades outside of her, where you get the heartbreak of Blue Sky Rain, the trudging hope of the next good time, or finding something closer to resolution and self-realization where time and history ceases to matter in the same way on I Forget the Rest and There's Always Room, which is a really nice sentiment and serves as a great conclusion for the album. That being said, there are songs like The Gift and Walk the Walk that tread really close to a lot of self-help cliches, and I struggle to say that there's any song here as layered or potent in the performance or writing as Wait on the Wine or Softball. It's still a beautiful album that's quite great, and it's gonna fly under the radar for a lot of folks. So yeah, make the time. Check this out. Next up, from Lizzy McAlpine, 5 Seconds Flat.
To play as you speak.
When the critical acclaim started pouring in for this singer-songwriter in the past month or so, seemingly from out of nowhere, I knew eventually I'd have to investigate, and then I discovered she built a lot of groundswell off of TikTok, and seemed relatively well connected to acts like Jacob Collier, Dodie, and even Phineas, the sort of independent but industry insiders folk pop artists that seemed well timed to explode in 2020, only to get overshadowed by Phoebe Bridgers. Kind of a shame, really. You might be able to sketch parallels to any of the Boy Genius trio, or any slew of very polished bedroom pop acts that broke out around that time, but she's had good compositional instincts, decent stage presence, and pretty solid writing, so the next step would be for her to take a big leap to help her songs stick out a little bit more. Play off of more than just homespun, heartfelt intimacy. And for the most part, I'd argue this does, and winds up on the cusp of greatness as a result. For starters, this is the first time McAlpine's theater background really slides into focus, not just in giving her material a little bit more melodic swell and crescendos and punch when she often works to a lot of great effect, but also in the storytelling and the fractured romances that she explores, often with an acute knowledge of how they're gonna go off the rails or they should absolutely end, but still feeling drawn to the heady rush of them anyway, with a number of guest performers stepping up to play some characters in these stories, most notably Ben Kessler on the excellent back and forth of Reckless Driver, and even Phineas himself on Hate to Be Lame. Now, it doesn't exactly give the album a lot more greater flair or the hooks of a project like Charlie Adams' Bullseye, and the writing does not have the emotional weight or detail in the same way that Phoebe Bridgers, Lucy Dacus, or even the most recent Taylor Swift projects do. The closer parallels probably Dodie with a little bit more self-assuredness, and the fact that there are so many obvious comparison points doesn't exactly help this stand out as much as it really could, especially chemtrails and paralleling certain moments on Punisher. But you know what? That doesn't mean that there aren't some great moments here. I really love the swelling bombast and the melodic change-ups and the breakup of Doomsday and the grand dreams of All My Ghosts. Jacob Collier adds some really nice vocal overdubs to all the pulsating build of Erase Me. Hell, the vocal arrangements on this entire album can be legit beautiful. Listen to the achingly sad Called You Again against the strings, it's stunning. And the album probably has its most single-ready pop cut with the liquid groove of Orange Show Speedway. This album is actually bookended amazingly well, and that's a big high point for me. Hell, most of the lesser cuts I'd probably just brand as being a bit tepid or generic on the back half of the album, or have some wonky synths or percussion that feels a little bit stiffer than it should. Not even outright bad. And now I won't call this revolutionary or anything beyond some very soft-focused, well-polished pop folk. You've probably heard stuff in this subgenre with sounds like this for the past 20 years, but it's nearly great at being that. That's worth hearing. Next up, from Caitlyn Smith, Hi.
Saying goodbye, goodbye.
It seems odd that after Caitlyn Smith landed a 1-2 winning combination so effectively and quickly in pop country that this seemed to not really garner the same attention. Maybe it's because it felt more like an EP with 7 songs plus the intro, and the title track already being a song she gave to Miley Cyrus. Or maybe it's because Monument Records would rather spend time promoting Walker Hayes instead. Nashville remains as depressingly predictable as always. But after giving this a couple of listens, I think I might know why this hasn't attracted the same attention. Even if Caitlyn Smith has a huge presence on record that can make for some spectacular melodrama or some stunningly intimate romantic moments, this project doesn't really play for either. Instead, it locks into a lot of very likable but not exactly exceptional mid-tempo relationship songs that Lady Antebellum would have cut a decade ago, where the songs don't quite feel as lush with the cutting lyrical details or the sheer scale to make the best out of Caitlyn Smith's stunning vocals. Now granted, I'm not sure Smith was in the best position to showcase a lot of that scale. She produced the entire project herself, and while it is kind of impressive how warm and well balanced the guitars and the supple grooves are, you definitely get the most rough patches in the vocal pickups, where for someone with her firepower and range, you really want a top-of-the-line producer and engineering team. Now, I normally blame Monument for all of this, but given how they've mismanaged the acts that they care about, I actually going to give Caitlyn Smith a lot more credit for working with what she had. And hell, The Regretful, Maybe in Another Life, is a really damn solid attempt to make that gorgeously arranged pop country stunner that really is a cleanup in the vocal mixing and production, or a live cut away from being among her best songs. Now, you know, if you just take this as an EP, it's very solid. It's generally likable, if feeling a little bit lower stakes. But after 2 albums that underperformed more because of mismanagement on Monument's part rather than lack of quality, I'm not sure if this is gonna do what it needs for her to do to keep generating traction in the mainstream. So yeah, it's good, it's worth a quick listen, it just feels like a stopgap. Let's hope there's more coming soon. Next up, from Kelly Lee Owens, LP8. The one thing I stand behind the most when I covered Kelly Lee Owens' project Inner Song in 2020 is that when you've got an approach that's so tastefully minimalist and monochromatic, it's either going to click on a fundamental level or it's just going to fall weirdly flat. And while Inner Song is quite good, it just fell into that very subtle, classy niche where I respected it a lot more than I liked it. So I had no idea why I chose to seek her out in this follow-up without any prompting. Nobody put this on my schedule. I was just curious. And yet this really clicked for me in a way I did not expect. Now, it absolutely feels like a swerve from what Kelly Lee Owens delivered on Inner Song. The pop-adjacent melodic hooks are almost entirely gone in favor of the ambient textures and tones that almost seem indebted to some misty Celtic folk, which feel more expansive and sprawling and spilling over her ethereal vocals and the touches of chimes. And the grooves and the melodic sequences, they feel less rigid and locked in, which allows for the quaking bass to feel a lot more shuddering and explosive. Seriously, the low end on this album is so well balanced and it's such subtly mixed texture that it's got this roiling presence without overpowering the mix. It's truly striking. Working with the noise artist Lasse Marag, Owens has described this album as fitting somewhere in between Enya and throbbing gristle, where it flits across a lingering tension between that rumbling post-industrial foundation and something that's more yearning and serene. Maybe a little bit of Dead Can Dance and Object as well, especially in the glistening, chittering fragments of melody, where the spare lyrics imply how you cannot control that flow of energy between it, and those who have tried push things ever so slightly off balance. That will be corrected, with the last song seeming to imply that it's a message sent back from the future for us to make that correction. Now, all of that can make for a bit of a weird listen, and I will say the pacing of this project can feel a little askew, especially in comparison with how tight Inner Song was, which felt a lot more focused and self-contained. But there's this mutated organic instability and texture to LP8 that's got a lot more character to it for me, which holds its balance and its atmosphere so effectively while never feeling antiseptic or static, and it really stuck with me. If you're more of a fan of the structure and the streamlined hooks of Inner Song, I cannot promise this will work for you. It's going to be divisive, but to me this is Kelly Lee Owens' most adventurous and interesting project to date. Pretty damn great. Check it out. Next up, from Let's Eat Grandma, 2 Ribbons.
See the year coming to bloom.
I think it's fair for me to say in 2018, I wasn't effectively prepared to talk about Let's Eat Grandma. Now, the easy thing to say would be that I just didn't get it. And while I like it a little bit more with time, it still never has fully clicked. But I think what I was missing was context and vocabulary. I wasn't really drawing the connections to what hyperpop was materializing as at the time, and I missed the mark in trying to put it all together. And while hyperpop remains incredibly hit and miss for me 4 years later, I now feel a lot better equipped to talk about what Let's Eat Grandma did, and instead what we got was the sort of accessible, pulsating 80s inspired synthpop that wouldn't be far removed from anything that Carly Rae Jepsen or Aurora or any number of imitators have done in the past 5 to 7 years. If anything, it reminds me a lot of the same pivot that Charlie XCX did with Crash earlier this year, moved towards a more conventional sound, a lot in the texture to streamline those sharper compositional instincts that didn't exactly wow me 4 years ago, given this group's tendency to meander and leads to multiple interludes on a 10-song album that don't really go anywhere, and that's just as true here in Two Ribbons. Don't get me wrong, on a textural level, there's still this ethereal gloss that fits in with the gauzy synths, the soft echoing guitars, both acoustic and electric, especially on the back half, and the husky cooing delivery that all feels very soft-focused, very well balanced and produced. But I'm not sure the pulsating hooks or melodies are all that distinctive enough to really stand out for me here, amidst the vibes that are really losing a lot of momentum by the back half. Now, I don't begrudge how difficult this might have been to make given the losses that this group has suffered the past couple of years, and that becomes the emotional undercurrent of the album, and how a lot of that emotional tension materialized between the duo. Probably the most obvious on Happy New Year, where their reconciliation is actually met off with the sound of fireworks, or the coursing guitar driving the release of Watching You Go off of some of the chimes, or the buzzy riffs that build and swell across Insect Loop. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Future Islands on that song, bizarrely enough. But maybe it's how the vocal delivery feels a little bit muted in selling some of those emotions, or how the lyricism often leans a lot more heavily on abstraction that doesn't feel that unique or evocative, or just how certain events on the album feel like they're occurring kind of out of order. The album winds up feeling less complete. And while of course that is part of the point, given that thematically it lands on all the sweeping questions of what will happen after death and how they can fill in the absence in their lives, questions that they really cannot answer, which kind of reminds me a little of Sufjan Stevens' Carrie and Lowell, which had a very similar thematic arc in this lane. The emotional buildup just feels off. It almost seems like the duo splitting up was treated with higher dramatic stakes than the losses highlighted on Strange Conversations in the title track. But when you root your wide-angle, open-ended conclusion in the album in all of those losses, the payoff doesn't align, it doesn't match up. Yeah, there's a real-life connection implied between the two, but it doesn't translate as well as it could. Hell, they got a song called Levitation about the mixed results of feeling detached from reality, a sense of dizzy confusion that's later mirrored to better effect on House of Mirrors with some of its odd horn solos. And on that level, it serves as metatext to my emotional experience with the album. Just a little confused. I get where it's going, but it doesn't click. Not saying it's bad. It's well produced, there's a tightness and gloss to the best moments that's actually pretty impressive, and I respect the connections that it's trying to make. I get how this will work for a lot of people. I just feel like I was held at arm's length from really threading those tenuous connections. It's a good album, not a great one. And finally, from Miranda Lambert, Palomino.
Our world, and I wanna see it all, so I keep moving. I'm just a tourist.
This is gonna sound a bit weird, but I'm gonna say it. I think Miranda Lambert has felt a little adrift for some time now. And that's not a critique so much as an observation. There's been a searching quality in her music that's led projects to feel scattered or sprawling, sometimes to great effect, like The Weight of These Wings, or the healing that she seemed to find on that last Pistol Annie's album in 2018, but sometimes to disappointment, such as 2019's Wild Card, where she swapped in her longtime producer for Jay Joyce, and it really didn't work. But hey, she had that niche project with with Jack Ingram called the Marfa Tapes that was actually pretty solid, and some of her collaborations from that album are now working on this, even in re-recording songs like In His Arms, Geraldine, and Waxahachie, what some have described as something more of a vintage travelogue approach. And, you know, I mean, it's not like it's unfamiliar territory for Miranda Lambert. She's written a lot of material in this lane before, going back years now. But while this is a better album than Wildcard, pretty much on production alone, it doesn't quite grip me like Miranda Lambert at her peak in the 2000s, and I think I pinpointed why. Intensity and stakes. Because Miranda Lambert is a sort of performer who can sell the weighty scenes and big emotions, push things to the brink that many will not go to in mainstream country. But Palomino is not aiming for that height of drama. It's looser, it's more relaxed, consistently warm in the guitar textures and generally well balanced in the low end to a fault. And there's little in the way of obvious duds in terms of the production, a big improvement from Jay Joyce. But also not much in the way of standouts that really grab me in terms of lyrical flair or punch, especially as Miranda Lambert has included a lot of songs like this that have been scattered across her career, both solo and with the Pistol Annies. Yeah, there are songs that feel a bit more fractured, like the jittery Actin' Up, the lumbering I'll Be Lovin' You, or the kooky B-52s collab, Music City Queen, that feels a bit more like a gimmick, as does the overproduced Country Money that feels like something Jenny Tolman delivered way better earlier this year. I mean, it plays better when we get the Mick Jagger cover Wandering Spirit that Miranda Lambert does deliver well, but more often than not, there's this odd feeling of detachment with a lot of these songs. Not that Miranda Lambert's in cruise control, but that it's almost routine for her at this point. A little two-dimensional and painting with detail, but without much greater emotional depth, or revealing much more Miranda Lambert herself. I mean, at its best we get songs like Tourist, and That's What Makes the Jukebox Play, where that tangible distance and loneliness is there, and gives Miranda Lambert's detachment a little bit more emotional weight. And Carousel is a really striking dream country-esque closer, where she tells the story of a woman retiring from the circus, where the perspective changed from third person to first person, and you realize that her detachment might be signaling wistful dreams of her own for settling down. But at its worst, we can't get away from the weirdly impersonal pileup of cliches that are more colloquial that ran through Wildcard, now on songs like Strange. And I can't be the only one who hears songs like In His Arms and Waxahachie, and wonders why two of the best songs on this album were imported from an earlier project. I mean, that's kind of telling on a drifting album that already has momentum problems and kind of runs long. Again, it's not a bad album. As a whole, I think it's mostly pretty solid. But if Miranda Lambert needs to step away, recharge the batteries, find more inspiration to come back with real fire to get back to her best, not gonna complain either. It's good, but if she needs to take the break to find greatness, I wouldn't mind. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be extremely grateful. I know I went through a lot of albums, pretty much all from ladies here, but hey, sometimes you gotta do that. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys have comments on anything I've covered, leave them down there below. Have fun. But beyond that, if you want to help support the channel, get albums onto my schedule, or hell, just argue with me directly on my Discord, link to my Patreon is right over there. Don't feel obligated, tough times, I understand, but options are available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.